It seems as if everyone wants to criticize the church today. The church criticizes the church. The pastors criticize the church. The world criticizes the church. Everybody and their brother wants to criticize the church. And maybe in some of that we've begun to ask the question, why is the church here? No doubt the church has some issues, and we've seen some of those things, but what good is the church? I think it's even a good question to ask, what if the church didn't exist? How would our community, how would our world be different if there was no church? Lately, I think that we've heard plenty of criticism about the church. We hear it from pastors, and we hear it from people within the church, without the church. A lot of criticism about the church. About 129 years ago, a group of people came together, and if you look at the building that I'm sitting in, they put their energy and effort into producing a place where they could gather and they could worship God and make a difference in their community. Maybe with all the criticism today, we wonder if the church is really worth the effort. Is it worth the energy that we put into it? I believe that it is. And I think today it's time for us to bring back honor to the church. What if the church didn't exist? What if it wasn't anywhere to be found? How different would our community be? If the church didn't exist, it'd be a very different world for women especially. What we discover early on is that because of the message of Jesus, we discover that women are joint heirs with Christ. They're equal with men. They're not a commodity. They're not a product. They're valuable human beings. They weren't treated that way early on. They were kept from education. They were kept from holding important offices. But when the gospel began to be preached, all of a sudden, the church rises up and says women are important. Our missionaries, when they first got to China, what they discovered was this horrible practice where women's feet were bound because the men of the community thought that women with small feet were valuable or attractive. They would bind their feet with cotton linen, and they would wrap them tightly and deform their feet so they would fit into very tiny shoes. It's a ridiculous practice, and today we would say that's archaic, but that's exactly how it was. Before the missionaries got there, it had taken place for 1,000 years. The missionaries began to sound the alarm. The church began to work, saying, wait a second, women shouldn't be subject to such barbaric practices. After a short period of time of them talking about it in community and the church working in the community, all of a sudden the government of China decided that they would outlaw binding the feet of women, and they did just that. And women were allowed to go free. The world would be a very different place for women if there was no church. How about the church's contribution in the area of hospitals? Early on, the church ministered among the sick and those that no one else wanted to touch. Jesus in Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, gives his disciples this mandate. He said, go out and cast out demons and heal people of all different kinds of sicknesses. Early on, the church couldn't do much about it because of the great persecution against the church. But around 313, Constantine, after winning against his co-emperor, he began to relieve the pressure so that the church could begin to establish institutions, hospitals, if you will, so that people who were poor, who were outsiders, the marginalized, could be helped. And that's exactly what they did. In about 325, the church established its first order for hospice, is what they called it. And they said, let's do this. In every community where there's a church, let's establish a hospital. The first hospitals were established by the church. These were places where people could be treated from their sicknesses, where medical sciences could develop, where the poor could be fed. They were places where people who had no other alternative could come. The hospital was established by the church. Early on, the church was first to establish hospitals. Around 313, when Constantine won against his co-emperor, he established the opportunity for churches to actually begin to take a more active role in social reform. One of the first things that the church did in 325 was establish that in every city where there was a church, they would establish a hospital as well. It was called hospice. It was a place where people could come who had sicknesses and diseases, and they had illnesses, a place for people to be fed, for the poor to assemble, for needs to be met, for the marginalized. It was a place where people could find help where they couldn't find it anywhere before. The church established the hospital. In 1524, the very first hospital in America was established. Not long after Hernan Cortez had landed in this land, the church established its first hospital, the Church of Jesus of Nazareth in Mexico City. In fact, it still exists today and is still treating and helping patients in the same spirit that it was when the church established it. In 1854, Florence Nightingale, a church partner is on the seashore of the Black Sea. She's treating British soldiers who are coming off the battlefield, badly wounded. She spends as much as 24 hours at one setting on her knees treating their wounds. At the same time, she's taking their names and she's writing letters to their families so that their family might know what has happened to them. When she comes back, she establishes her work for the next 50 years of putting together what we now see as the nursing profession. In 1860, she establishes the first school of nursing in St. Thomas Hospital in London. And so today, we can look at the profession of nursing and realize that it finds its roots in the church. In 1871, Clara Barton established the American Red Cross. She saw the need among the soldiers on the battlefield. As a church partner, she realized that it was her responsibility to do something for people who were in need, who were hurting. The Red Cross was a symbol and a picture of Christ's mercy. Today it's recognized around the world. It finds its roots in the church. How about in the area of education? What did the church contribute there? In 1436, Johannes Gutenberg, a church partner, wanted a way of reproducing the Bible rapidly. At this point, if you had any kind of literature or written text, it was laborious to get it at best. There was no way of mass producing books. And so Johannes Gutenberg decided that he would build some type of mechanical printing press, and he did exactly that. When he finished it, the first book he printed, guess what it was? It was the Bible. It's called the 42-line Gutenberg Bible because there was 42 lines on every page. Now, did the church keep that technology to itself because they created it? They sure didn't. They opened it up to literature and poetry and all kinds of books. Today, you'll find libraries filled. Why? Because the church pioneered the technology to print books. Today, you can sit in the library and you can read books because God worked through His people and knowledge increased and the world was blessed. How about in the area of schools? What did the church contribute there? Well, early on, in places just like this, the church building was the only place of assembly in a community. It was oftentimes the church building on Sunday, but through the week it was also the school, the place of education. The pastor very often was the only person in an entire community who had any kind of education whatsoever. So it was up to him to teach reading and writing and other skills that people would need. He would teach even adults who had gone their entire life working on a farm or in extreme circumstances how to read. And he educated them so that their life might be changed and that their kids might have an opportunity at a greater future. The church was a significant place. It played a significant role in the education of the early pioneer communities in America. In 1780, Robert Reichs decided that he wanted to educate the poor children in his community. He had one problem. The kids worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their only day off was Sunday. He did something crazy. He decided very early on Sunday morning that he would invite the kids to his home. And he would invite them there with the opportunity to educate them. And so that's exactly what he did. He began calling it Sunday school. Maybe you've heard of it. And he would bring the kids in. He only asked that they would wash their hands and wash their face. And he would bring them in and teach them basic mathematics, basic reading skills, and how to write. And the kids in his community were radically changed. It's funny that this Sunday school thing took off, and all of a sudden it went west and all over the place. And churches all around began to offer Sunday school on Sunday morning so that the poor kids of their community could get their education. That's where most kids in early America began to learn to read and write, was in their Sunday school classes that would happen by way of their pastor in their church on Sunday morning. Such a great contribution. Here we go. The church has a role in the abolition of slavery as well. November 1837, a man named Elijah Lovejoy, he owns a printing press and he's also a Presbyterian preacher. He is unabashedly preaching the message that owning slaves and trafficking human beings and slavery is wrong. He's murdered for it. Militant slave owners come into his shop and they kill him right there. But not before he inspires another pastor, another Presbyterian preacher named Edward Beecher. Edward Beecher then took up the mantle and he began to preach the same message, that we can't treat people in such a way. In fact, he was so fiery in his messages, he inspired his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And because she was so inspired what her brother had done, she wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which shined a light on the horrible atrocities of slavery that was happening in America. pastors all over. In fact, most of the revolt against slavery was led by church pastors in rural parts of the southern part of the United States. They would stand up and they would preach, and many times lose their life or suffer persecution and great loss because the communities that they were in didn't want to let go of a sinful practice that was there. In 1839, Charles Finney, a pastor who preached numerous revival services across the South, began to teach and preach the message that slavery was wrong and needed to be done away with. It was at one of these revival meetings that a young man named Theodore Wilde was converted. Theodore later wrote a book, Slavery as It Is. It was the research text that Harriet Beecher used for her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. These messages began to be sent out all across the land. Preachers began to rise up. In fact, there was a preacher and partner named Charles Torrey. He was known as the father of the Underground Railroad. Charles Torrey helped more than 100,000 slaves find their way to freedom. It was the church that was instrumental in the freeing and the changing of the practices of slavery. Not one small contribution, a huge thing. Imagine what the world would be like today if we continued to treat people as if they weren't humans. The church should be credited with what she's done well. No doubt she's made some mistakes. There's no doubt that there's some things we can point at. But shouldn't we bring honor back to what the church really is and what she has done? This radical faith that we've seen in the lives of so many people. The history needs to record the fact that the church has done significant and amazing things. In fact, of all of the institutions in common society today, no institution has done more to radically change our community for the good than the Church of Jesus. Regardless of denomination, regardless of background, regardless of who has their name or branding on it, the church that Jesus has established has done significant help and benefit to our community and the world at large.